Hi, my name is Amanda Wilkins and I'm from Montgomery, Alabama. My question is this: what about the Battle of Armageddon? Is it past or future?
Well, certainly the Battle of Armageddon is one of the fearsome features of the book of Revelation, perhaps second only to the beast of Revelation himself, that has so affected the minds of modern Christians and even of a modern culture and art. The Battle of Armageddon, when you mention that, in people's minds, you're mentioning something horrible, a great devastation. And so it is a big feature in the book of Revelation. To interpret it properly, though, we always have to put it in its setting. The Battle of Armageddon, I'll just tell you up front, and then I'll try to give you some evidence for it. The Battle of Armageddon is simply another phrase or another image to speak of the Jewish war against Rome, where the Roman armies came in and destroyed the city of Jerusalem, tore down its walls, devastated the temple, and killed 1.1 million Jews, put tens of thousands in slavery, and just wreaked absolute havoc upon Israel because they have rejected the Messiah, Jesus Christ. Now, that's my view. I believe AD 70 is what he's referring to. Now, why do I believe that? Well, remember first the general time frame of the book of Revelation. In chapter 1, verse 1, these things must shortly come to pass. Chapter 1, verse 3, the time is near. Chapter 22, verse 6, shortly take place. 22, verse 10, the time is near. In fact, there are other evidences through the book, Revelation 3:10, Revelation 6:11, and other places that mention a short time frame. But I mention those because they open the book and they close it, and they confine us to that particular era of time. So, the Battle of Armageddon cannot be 2,000 or 3,000 years in the future because it's in a book that claims to be dealing with approaching events. Well, what is the Battle of Armageddon? Well, in Revelation 16, where in verse 16 we have mention of the Battle of Armageddon, in verse 19 we find that the Battle of Armageddon has some kind of impact, some kind of horror that befalls the great city. Now, we need to ask the question, well, what is the great city? Now, the great city is referred to oftentimes in the book of Revelation as the great city Babylon. Well, obviously, Jerusalem is not Babylon. But we have to recognize the book of Revelation is a book of visions and of symbols. And what he's doing, I believe, is applying the symbol of Babylon to Jerusalem because Jerusalem has gotten as bad as Babylon ever was in God's sight. And interestingly, Babylon's the one that destroyed the first temple. And so now the image of Babylon, the temple-destroying people, is placed upon Israel and Jerusalem. They're going to destroy their own temple by their own deeds. Obviously the Romans actually did it, but it's because, once again, of the Jewish misdeeds. But how can I make that equation, the great city, which is called Babylon, how can I apply it to Jerusalem in addition to speaking of imagery? Well, as a matter of fact, if we read in Revelation 11, verse 8, we find the first mention in the book of Revelation of the great city. And where is the great city? It says, the great city where also their Lord was crucified. Now we have John telling us particularly of, quote, the great city, end quote. And he applies it to a particular idea. It's the place where the Lord was crucified. There's no other place on earth that we can name other than Jerusalem. So the first mention of the great city in the book of Revelation, the introduction of the great city in the book of Revelation, is told us right up front to be the place where the Lord was crucified. What we have here is an historical reference from Josephus, who was a Jew and was an eyewitness to the events of the book of Revelation, or my interpretation, but was an eyewitness to the events of the Jewish war on anybody's interpretation, tells us that he watched the siege. He saw the huge 10th Legion catapults throwing stones weighing 1 talent each upon the city. He tells us that they were white. Now, when John sees this in vision form, it's like a hailstone storm coming out of heaven. But what it is, we know historically, is that it is the Roman 10th Legion with their huge catapults, throwing white stones upon the city, which happened to weigh 1 talent each, which is precisely the measurement that the book of Revelation gives. So once again, the time frame ties us into the first century. The Battle of Armageddon is tied to the great city, which the book of Revelation tells us is the place where Jesus was crucified. And we find an interesting feature of the Armageddon destruction being talent weight hailstones falling upon the city. And that certainly, I believe, is a reference in visionary form of the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman 10th Legion.